Hello there. Welcome to Planet America. Coming to you from the Situation Room, I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello. And yet again, we've got a situation.
The federal government is under pressure to explain why a wrongfully deported Maryland man remains locked up in a prison in El Salvador.
We have millions of people that should not be in this country that are dangerous.
The Trump administration defied in the face of Supreme Court orders to bring back a man deported by an administrative error, and now Trump wants to send Americans into exile.
We're also going to look at the latest tit-for-tat tariffs and the return of political violence to America. But first...
It was very different in tone, but very consequential nonetheless.
Mr. President, it's an honor to have you. Thank you.
Unlike Donald Trump's infamous Oval Office appearance in February, where he and VP J.D. Vance castigated Ukraine's President Zelensky for an alleged lack of gratitude, his meeting this week with El Salvador's president was all smiles.
We're very happy and we're very eager to help.
President Nayib Bukele describes himself as the world's coolest dictator. When he says he's very eager to help, he means he's very eager not to help send one man in particular back to the United States. This man, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Garcia is among hundreds of Venezuelans and Salvadorans deported to El Salvador by the Trump administration using sweeping powers under the 1798 Alien Enemies Act for alleged membership of violent gangs. Like the others, Garcia wasn't afforded a trial. Allegations of gang membership based on things like association or clothing and tattoos being enough to send them to a notorious Salvadoran prison that was designed to house alleged terrorists.
The Trump administration has acknowledged that Abrego Garcia was deported back in March in violation of an immigration judge's order blocking his removal.
The Justice Department admitted Abrego Garcia's deportation was the result of an administrative error. Then,
the Supreme Court got involved in this back and forth between the Department of Justice and the Maryland district judge for the return of Garcia. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the DOJ must facilitate the return of Garcia.
The Supreme Court ruled unanimously the Department of Justice must facilitate his return to America. And government lawyers have told lower courts they will comply and provide updates on his condition. President Trump was asked about that, and he deferred to Attorney General Pam Bondi.
Two courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13.
Not exactly. A quick fact check on that. Abrego Garcia has never been charged with, let alone convicted of, being a member of any gang. Some evidence was introduced that he belonged to MS-13, and the judges decided that was enough to keep him in custody while the matter was resolved. But other judges have since found the same evidence to be lacking, saying, quote, the evidence against Abrego Garcia consisted of nothing more than his Chicago Bulls hat and hoodie, and a vague, uncorroborated allegation. And what about the world's coolest dictator who declared a state of emergency in El Salvador in 2022, which remains in place to quell gang violence? Is he going to send Garcia back to the United States?
How can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it.
And again, to be clear, although Abrego Garcia has been sent to a jail designed for terrorists, he has not been charged, much less convicted, of any terrorism offence, or indeed of any crime, including gang membership, which makes this exchange, caught on the Salvadoran government's live web stream before the meeting and before reporters were allowed into the room, all the more chilling.
I want him to do, homegrown criminals next. Yeah. I said, homegrowns are next. The homegrowns built. You got to build about 5 more places.
Yeah, that's fair.
All right.
So, not content with deporting foreign nationals to El Salvador, Trump is now saying next he wants to send Americans to foreign jails, and that is apparently A-OK with Bukele.
There's a lot to unpack here, John. Let's start by actually reading what the Supreme Court ordered. The government should be prepared to share what it can concerning the steps it has taken and the prospect of further steps to do that facilitation. So, does this sound like they're taking further steps to you?
If they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
Sounds to me like they're planning to take no steps whatsoever, which corresponds, by the way, with what they've told the district court judge. Nothing. And that seems to me to be a direct violation of a 9-0 Supreme Court order. What's most frustrating is the utter disingenuousness. John played Bukele earlier saying he doesn't have the power to force America to take Garcia. Now Pam Bondi's saying America doesn't have the power to force Bukele to release Garcia either. And that's odd, because their agreement specifically states that in a year's time, America will decide whether to take their prisoners back. But they can't do it now, apparently. Also, note the way Bukele referred to Garcia as a terrorist. Nothing alleged about it. He's just a terrorist. This is in keeping with the administration's argument that they didn't actually make a mistake when they sent Garcia to El Salvador. This was Steve Miller yesterday.
A DOJ lawyer who has since been relieved of duty, a saboteur, a Democrat, put into a filing incorrectly that this was a mistaken removal. It was not. This was the right person sent to the right place.
That's not true. It was the acting field office director of enforcement and removal operations at ICE who said that Garcia was sent to El Salvador because of, quote, an administrative error and an oversight. But I'll tell you who is vanishingly unlikely to be a gang member. This makeup artist, Andrew Romero Hernandez, who claimed he faced persecution in Venezuela due to his homosexuality. He's also rotting in the El Salvador prison. The ACLU got their hands on his paperwork, and this is the total evidence against him. It was found that detainee Hernandez has a crown on each one of his wrists. The crown has been found to be an identifier for a Trinidad gang member. That's it. Do you want to see these so-called gang tattoos? Behold, the most dangerous man on earth with his mum and dad's tattoos. That's apparently enough evidence to lock you up for the rest of your life in a gulag, because prisoners never seem to leave that place alive. By the way, did I mention that a Trinidad expert says that Trinidad doesn't use any tattoos as a form of gang identification? No Venezuelan gang does. So there's at least one person locked in that El Salvador prison who seems to have done nothing wrong other than being a migrant with a tattoo. His case is in court as well. So when the Supreme Court says he should be released, well, we've already seen what's going to happen. Nothing. And there'll be more innocent people, John. 90% of the people sent to that prison do not have criminal records. Most of them were sent there because of their tattoos, which we now know are irrelevant. And do you think Trump won't start doing this to citizens soon? He wasn't just muttering about it in a corner to Bukele. He was saying it out loud to everyone.
I'd like to go a step further. I mean, I said it to Pam. I don't know what the laws are. We always have to obey the laws, but we also have homegrown criminals that push people into subways, that hit elderly ladies on the back of the head with a baseball bat when they're not looking, that are absolute monsters. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country, but you'll have to be looking at the laws on that, Steve, okay?
This isn't a secret. He's just blurting it straight out. This is what he wants. Look, I know he keeps saying he's going to follow the law. That's nice. But, you know, he also said this.
If the Supreme Court said bring somebody back, I would do that. I respect the Supreme Court.
That was 2 days before he ignored the Supreme Court. Things often change in this administration, but not always for the better.
Yeah, indeed not. And earlier today, a federal district court judge chided the Trump administration for their continued refusal to seek Kilmar Abrego Garcia's return from El Salvador. There's a judge, Paula Zinnes, who ordered an intense 2-week inquiry into the matter after noting to date what the record shows is that nothing has been done. Nothing. The Justice Department argues that during Trump and Bukele's Oval Office appearance, the issue had been raised with the highest authority in that country and there was no hope of getting Abrego Garcia back. Well, for more, we're joined by Jean Reisz, immigration and detention law expert and associate professor of law at the University of Southern California. Professor Reisz, welcome to Planet America's Situation Room. So there we have it. The Salvadoran president says, well, we're not going to smuggle a terrorist back into the United States, and the Trump administration clearly has no appetite to bring him back. So is that? Or are there consequences to defying a Supreme Court ruling?
Well, it's interesting what's happening in the White House versus what's being argued by the government lawyers in the actual court case. I think there's a bit of a nuance, but it's significant. The government lawyers are saying we're complying with the court order to the extent that we believe the law requires us to comply, and that's just to remove any domestic obstacles. But we don't believe it's lawful for the court to order us to go into Salvadoran airspace, land in El Salvador, and extract a prisoner from their prisons. Now, that's not really an accurate characterization of what the court's order is saying. And another issue with that is that Mr. Abrego Garcia was placed there by the U.S. government. In fact, the U.S. government sent more prisoners to the Salvadoran prison over the weekend. So they have entered El Salvador airspace, landed in El Salvador, and placed people in those prisons. And the White House is saying, I can't tell the president of El Salvador to release Mr. Abrego Garcia. And the president of El Salvador is saying, I can't force the U.S. to take back Mr. Abrego Garcia. And that's not true either, because the president is supposed to return Abrego Garcia, and the fact that is basically saying he's not going to accept him back. I mean, another side issue here too is the government is really stating that he has no right to return because he's an MS-13 gang member. There's been no credible evidence provided of that so far, and that also doesn't have anything to do really with the law that's requiring them to return him because he was deported in error. So the president's saying, I'm not going to take him back. I don't have to. The president's lawyers in the court are saying legally we don't have to. And I think that's a difference because the government lawyers aren't prepared to say we're flouting the judicial authority here in the way I think that the president did in his meeting with Bukele.
Now, I'm not necessarily talking about Garcia in particular here, but there are more than 200 people in that situation where if you're an innocent person, say, locked up in a Salvadoran jail, and Bukele won't let you out, and the administration won't advocate on your behalf, what options do you have left?
I don't think you have any options left. And that's what's so terrifying about this, is that Mr. Abrego Garcia could foreseeably spend the rest of his life in a Salvadoran prison if the government does not take steps to return him. And what that means is the government can deport anyone without due process, even if it's a mistake. So that could be a US citizen, and say, well, now they're in a prison in a foreign country, so there's nothing we can do about it. So the president has to enforce the law, not try and find ways around it. And it's really seeming to be that that's what the government's doing here. And they're kind of playing games with the judicial process.
Professor, looking at the two presidents in the Oval Office this week, it seems there's little doubt that President Bukele would do anything that Donald Trump were to ask him to do. Is there anything the law can do about what appears to be a blatant charade?
That's the tipping point that we're at, where the judicial branch can order the president to act within the law and the Constitution, but can't order the president how to behave in foreign relations. I honestly don't think that the meeting in the White House helped the government's case, because it does show that the president can just ask Bukele to return Abrego Garcia. The president is reportedly paying $6 million to the El Salvador to hold detainees. It can say, I'm not going to give you that money until you return this person. But the government's saying the courts can't tell him to do that, because that involves his sole authority to interact with foreign governments. The only way to really enforce the president, because the president is the enforcer, is then now to have Congress take some sort of action to impeach a president because that president isn't following the law, or that president is not recognizing the authority of another branch of government. So it's almost like a game of chicken. The president is pushing back very hard, and the courts are going as far as they can without interfering with the executive branch, but also recognizing the consequences of having an individual sent to a prison where he's likely to be tortured in violation of American law, and then that be the end of it, and the president can get away with it.
What current administration policies most worry you from a legal point of view?
I think there's two policies. I think we're really using ideological reasons to deter people from coming to the U.S., to force an agenda on institutions and states. And I think also the attempts to circumvent due process, that's including using the Alien Enemies Act, that's including refusing to return Abrego Garcia. That's troubling to me because due process and the court's ability to kind of check the president's power by determining whether certain actions are in violation of U.S. law or in violation of the Constitution seem to be at a precarious place right now. And if that were the case, then there would be a lot of lives destroyed for people, citizens and non-citizens, because many citizens in the U.S. have family members who are immigrants in their family. And so a lot of lives would be destroyed and maybe irreparably harmed.
Professor Jean Reisz, thanks for joining us in Planet America's Situation Room.
Thanks.
It's safe to say it's been pretty hard to try and keep up with Trump's escalating tariff war. So here for you is a quick recap. After spending the first few weeks of his second term threatening and pausing tariffs, mostly with Canada and Mexico, 2 weeks ago, on April 2nd, Trump's so-called Liberation Day saw him impose what he has described as reciprocal tariffs on imports from just about every country in the world, based on trade deficits, with a default 10% for countries like Australia, where the US has a surplus.
Hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
We'll see about that. Meanwhile, last week he paused most of those tariffs for 90 days after the stock and bond markets went into freefall. That default 10% tax on imports remained, and Trump claimed that a deal was close.
I could make every deal in one day if I wanted to. I could do this all in one day. I could just say, here's what we'll do.
Really? Meanwhile, Trump was still engaged with a tit-for-tat trade war with China. It started with the US lifting existing tariffs on Chinese imports to 34%. China immediately matched that. So the US hiked their China tariff by another 50 percentage points to 84%. Then added the 10% across-the-board rate and another 10% for good measure.
When America is punched, he punches back harder. That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight.
But it was China who punched back next with 84% tariffs. So the US added another 21 points for a nice round 125 percentage points. Oh, and added those two lots of 10% again as well for a grand total of 145%. So, you guessed it, China hit back again.
Overnight, Beijing announcing a 125% tariff on U.S. imports.
Then on Monday, news broke that a lot of technology being imported into America, including things like smartphones that include components from right around the world, would be exempt from, at least for now, all of those tariffs.
You have to show a certain flexibility. Nobody should be so rigid. You have to have a certain flexibility.
Yeah, so a certain kind of flexibility there, Chaz.
He's certainly flexible, John. But I'm sorry to say the confusion doesn't end there. Firstly, there are exceptions to the tariff exceptions. These exceptions are only for the 10% global tariffs and the 125% extra Chinese tariffs. But other tariffs still apply, such as the 20% tariff you mentioned before, placed on China because of its alleged role in the fentanyl trade. Also, Trump on Sunday tweeted out that there was actually no tariff exception announced at all. Oh. They were just moving those tariffs to a different bucket, apparently. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick struggled gamely to explain what this all meant.
Those products are going to be part of the semiconductor sectoral tariffs, which are coming. So what he's doing is he's saying they're exempt from the reciprocal tariffs, but they're included in the semiconductor tariffs, which are coming in probably a month or two.
Look, I actually do get this. Eventually there's going to be special car tariffs, semiconductor tariffs, and pharmaceutical tariffs. And they're going to be separate from the other tariffs. So they're just getting that started now, removing the semiconductors from the general tariff pool. That's what's going on. But it's still very haphazard. And if you come with me, I will show you what I mean. Of course, uncertainty is a killer in economics because when people are uncertain, they don't spend and businesses don't invest, and it drives the country into a recession. So when America's uncertainty index looks like That's not good. The uncertainty is nearly twice what it was during the pandemic, and it reflects the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index as well, which is at its lowest level since Joe Biden's nadir in mid-2022. It's lost more than 30 points just since December. By the way, those two results you see there, they're the worst results since 1952. So Americans aren't real chipper right now. As for inflationary expectations, well, this is what people are expecting to be the inflation rate in a year's time. 6.7%. That is way more than back in 2022. So why do we care about this anyway? It's because this affects behaviour, and it makes it more likely that inflation will actually occur. What about investors? The big game. Well, let me explain this 10-year bond yield curve to you. The yield curve shows you the interest rates that 10-year government bonds are paying investors. Normally, the interest rate for 10-year bonds mirrors the US dollar index, and the reason for that is when yields are high, paying off a lot, investors buy more bonds, and it drives the dollar up. And indeed, that usually happens, and it did happen right up to Liberation Day. Have a look here. The dollar index is the green, the yield curve is the yellow. They're mirroring each other, aren't they? All the way up to the day that tariffs were announced. And then, look at this. The yield curve shoots up, the dollar index shoots down, going in completely different directions. This reflects investors freaking out and refusing to buy bonds anymore. At times like this, a major crash is really close, and that's why Trump took a minor step back last week. But since that moment, let's blow up that yield curve and show you a zoom in. This was when he made his announcement. You can see the yield curve dropped a little to reflect the dollar index, but just a little. Hasn't stayed down though, has it? In fact, it's actually bounced back. And the dollar is still low. So the problem hasn't actually gone away. America is still on the precipice of a financial crash. And John, all this uncertainty is not helping at all.
Yeah, and that is one thing we can say is certain. It is making it increasingly hard right now to imagine what the future looks like, but here's a thought.
Elon Musk is cutting everything, even his own savings targets.
This is the chainsaw for bureaucracy. Chainsaw!
How much do you think we can rip out of this wasted $6.5 trillion Harris-Biden budget?
I think we can do at least $2 trillion.
Yeah!
$2 trillion in savings.
Cut the budget deficit in half from $2 trillion to $1 trillion.
Now, $1 trillion in savings.
Chainsaw!
We anticipate savings in FY26 from reduction of waste and fraud by $150 billion.
Now just $150 billion savings.
Chainsaw!
You're in Planet America's Situation Room. A 38-year-old man is in custody charged with attempted murder, terrorism, aggravated arson and aggravated assault after allegedly setting fire to the home of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro as he and his family slept.
Lori and I are overwhelmed by the prayers.
The governor's mansion was extensively damaged in the fire, which happened at 2 o'clock on Sunday morning. Just hours earlier, Shapiro, a Democrat widely expected to mount a presidential campaign in 2028, had been sharing a Seder dinner with family and friends at the start of the Jewish Passover celebrations.
This kind of violence is becoming far too common in our society. And I don't give a damn if it's coming from one particular side or the other, directed at one particular party or another, or one particular person or another. It is not okay. And it has to stop. We have to be better than this.
Shapiro is right. This is just the latest in a string of politically motivated attacks in the United States. Among them, last December, Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare, who was shot and killed outside a New York hotel. In September last year, then presidential candidate Donald Trump was the alleged target of an assassination attempt in Florida. 2 months earlier, of course, Trump had been shot and slightly wounded by a would-be assassin at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. In 2022, Paul Pelosi, the husband of the then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, was attacked with a hammer inside the couple's home. In January 2021, supporters of President Trump stormed the US Capitol building to try and stop his election defeat from being formalised. 7 deaths among law enforcement and protesters have been associated with that violence.
Not to mention all the arson involving Teslas recently as well. I know we often treat that like a joke, but just this week, a guy was arrested for arson attacks on first a Tesla showroom and then the Republican headquarters in New Mexico. That is absolutely also political violence. Also, I think it's hard to talk about political violence without backing it over that shooting of the healthcare CEO you mentioned before, because none of those other cases we talked about are people considered to be heroes.
The perpetrators.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas the healthcare CEO shooter, Luigi Mangione, is absolutely been lionised by certain left-wing populists. Not everyone, but some. This was just this week.
You're going to see women especially that feel like, oh my God, right? Like, here's this man who's revolutionary, who's famous, who's handsome, who's young, who's smart. He's a person that seems this morally good man, which is hard to find.
I don't know what we just watched, but I don't like where this is going, John.
Yeah, no, we're good, that's for sure. With the Easter holiday comes the annual White House tradition of rolling Easter eggs across the South Lawn. Despite concerns over egg prices and a strain on supply due to the avian flu, the White House is pushing ahead with this event. And this year, they're inviting some, shall we say, new guests. Here's Melina Wicks to explain in the briefing room.
The Easter egg roll is the oldest annual tradition at the White House. It's a festive occasion, bringing together families, the politicians that represent them, and as of this year, corporate sponsors.
The White House, through an outside production company called Harbinger, is soliciting corporate sponsorships for this year's Easter egg roll.
Yes, the White House is soliciting corporate cash through a company called Harbinger, a term that's usually followed by the words of doom. They put out a 9-page guide for potential sponsors, including a platinum package for $200,000. So what do you get for that?
Naming rights for key areas or elements, sponsor logos featured on event signage, custom branded baskets, snacks, beverages, or souvenirs, and mentions in official event communication and social media posts.
Sponsors are also promised the chance to engage with White House reporters, as well as 150 tickets for the event, which are usually distributed to families through a lottery system. So now local kids can gorge on chocolate while hobnobbing with Brad from government relations at the Coca-Cola Company. Money raised from the event will go to the White House Historical Association. And to be fair, corporate contributions to the event aren't new. It's long been privately funded, including through the American Egg Board. Although with inflation the way it is, most families would probably just prefer some free eggs. What's different this time is the promise of explicit branding. You would think there'd be some kind of rule against that.
And of course, all of this directly goes against regulations prohibiting public officials from promoting private businesses. But of course, this is a regulation, not a criminal statute.
And let's be honest, it probably wouldn't matter even if it was. The Trump White House argues ethics laws technically don't apply to the president. But presidents going back to Nixon have made a point of complying with them anyway. In quainter times, George W. Bush's ethics lawyers wouldn't even allow public schools to be named after the president, for fear of being seen to favour one group over another. But now the cat's out of the bag, why stop at sponsoring the Easter egg roll? You could have the State of the Union, brought to you by Western Union Money Transfers, or the Department of Health and Human Services, brought to you by cod liver oil and vitamin A, or mass deportations, brought to you by United Airlines, for when you really want people to suffer all the way home. Hey, the government needs the money since Doge took a chainsaw to it. Brought to you by Home Depot. Corporate sponsorship of an official White House event may be tacky and against ethics rules, but at least it means one government employee's job is safe.
That's it for No Restricted Planet America. See you back here in the Situation Room next Wednesday night at 9 p.m. on ABC TV, from 8 p.m. on ABC iView, YouTube and Facebook.
We've got Good Friday off, but you can catch up on recent episodes on iView as well as online, and longer interviews, bonus stuff, all kinds of good stuff. See you there.
Bye-bye.